Well, first I want to start by thanking Professors Stimson and the conference for their kind invitation to come and for supporting me to attend. These are supposed to be personal observations. I was asked to say a few key points about the conference, lessons learned, so on. So compared to most of the speakers and attendees here, I'm certainly a relative newcomer to e-cigarettes. But I am very familiar with two big elements of the change the endgame mission here. One of them is that as an addiction psychiatrist, the concept and practice of harm reduction is second nature. I work in a methadone clinic part-time, and other harm reduction or harm minimization interventions such as needle exchange, condoms, naloxone for the police to carry around and help people with acute overdoses. That's just sort of second nature. So very comfortable with the concept of harm reduction. And secondly, I've long been fascinated with what I would call the culture wars in medicine, public health, and science. Another way of putting it is that I'm interested in the distorting effects of ideology and moral psychology on health policy. And e-cigarettes are a gold mine of a case study. In fact, I was initially drawn to this issue because of a striking paradox, which others have noted, which is to say that harm reduction for mostly sex and drugs is not just merely tolerated by most public health experts, it's promoted. Yet when it comes to nicotine, which is far more benign than heroin, cocaine, alcohol, club drugs, and marijuana, about which, incidentally, there's a very robust and very fair-minded public debate going on in the U.S., trying to balance the, protecting kids, but honoring personal preferences, discussion over the potential implications of corporatizing marijuana, big pot. But this is a healthy, transparent debate that we're having. But somehow these public health experts who are willing to engage in that urge abstinence for nicotine and downplay the importance of a less risky alternative. So why the inconsistency? What's with the hypocrisy? Well, it's a complicated blend of factors. I'm going to go into all of them here. But one is, of course, the long shadow of distrust and contempt for tobacco companies, and also a corollary, which is a suspicion of private interests over public management. And this is sort of a dispositional trait of many public health workers in general. I mean, public health, when you think about public health practice, it's the kind of enterprise that's very much top-down, and because it operates at such a large scale, it often legitimately needs government to make it effective. So that's an orientation that public health experts are very much at ease with. But this dynamic is even complicated by something bigger, which I would say is a worldview, a kind of constellation of values. I referred to it earlier as moral psychology. We've thrown around some names in the last 2 days. Jonathan Haidt, I'm sure you've heard this. I suspect most people know who he is, but his book, The Righteous Mind, summarizes brilliantly all his work and his theories. And then there's another psychologist, all these people are psychologists, named Dan Kahan, who's at Yale. He calls his work cultural cognition. These are the two we mentioned the most. I think Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize winning, actually he won it for economics, but he is a psychologist, thinking fast and slow. Then another two folks who are less well known but equally brilliant, Phil Tetlock at the University of Pennsylvania and Paul Slovic. They've all looked at how decision making and worldview are influenced by what they might call moral intuitions. Kahan, for example, is interested in, and I'm quoting here, tribal biases that mediate our encounters with scientific knowledge, end quote. But this is one reason why otherwise smart people, and yes, there are a number of people on the other side who are technically smart. They have respectable IQs, but why we and they might find ourselves in scientific conflict. It's not necessarily ignorance of the subject matter. Sometimes it is. You wish it were, because then if people are educable, the problem can be resolved fairly easily. But it's not necessarily ignorance of the facts, but rather differences in how people judge risk, express their identities, how individualistic they tend to be, how communitarian, how they engage in motivated reasoning. I don't know if they're familiar with that term, but basically it's how you look at the same information but somehow manage to read, it's almost Rorschach-like, manage to read different messages in it, and worse, how you deal with the information that's not there, how you might fill in an informational vacuum. And in the case of many of the critics of harm reduction, they fill it in with doubt-mongering, with very much a pessimistic, half-empty view, and their first impulse is to constrain freedom to engage in new practices. I'll just talk a little bit more about Jonathan Haidt. You hear so much of him, but because I just want to walk you through his model. And I apologize for not having a slide. I had to listen to all the talks and then figure out what I was going to do. And so he would argue that a person's view of an issue, in this case e-cigarettes, but is a product of the relative weight that he or she places on 6 moral foundations. Now, I'll tell you what those 6 foundations are in a minute, but what's important to realize is that this weighting process, W-E-I-G-H, weighing process, is often unconscious, and we're not even aware we're doing it, and that many of our explicit rationales for why we feel this way, why we think this way, are actually what he would say backfilled, kind of confabulated after the fact. In other words, you have a sense of how the world should work or how something should look, but actually you end up explaining it almost, after the fact. In other words, your emotional reaction is the one that really determines your view. So these 6, what he calls axes, or axes of moral foundations, sometimes he calls them moral taste buds. The first is a care versus harm. There aren't axes from care, or in this case care, to its opposite, which would be harm. And everyone has all these 6 in their mind, and to some extent they're probably innate. I think some of them are changed through experience, but some of them are also innate, and that's not surprising either, to the extent that temperament probably has a large genetic component. We won't get into that, but the point is, let me explain. So care and harm, and of course, if you're on the care, if you weigh your moral intuition such that care is very important to you, then obviously protecting others is a highly valued activity. And how does that manifest? Now this is really what I want to do here, is go through each of these and show how they manifest in the vaping wars, or in the debate we're having about this issue publicly. So a care harm, if you emphasize care, you're likely to see paternalistic behavior. Well, we've seen that. The second axis is fairness versus cheating. But if you tend to emphasize fairness, as I said, everyone has these intuitions. It's just a matter of their relative importance to the individual. But anyway, emphasizing fairness might manifest itself, would probably manifest itself there as an expression of radical egalitarianism, discomfort with risk, with high risk perception, and a precautionist orientation. Everyone has to get the same. The idea is that, and this is sort of a classic political dichotomy, which is to say, do you guarantee opportunity or do you guarantee outcome? And people who are more focus more on fairness are more interested in emphasizing equality of outcome. And there are times that each of these may make sense. Again, these are largely patterns. Another one, I'll speed up, is liberty on one side, oppression on the other. So as you can imagine, people who may not value autonomy as much as some of us would be more comfortable with bans or a restriction on legislation. Then there's the fourth axis is loyalty versus betrayal. And that maps onto the strength of in-group affiliation and identity, the pull of the group, the quote-unquote tribalness that Joe Gitchell has referred to a number of times. Number 5 is authority versus subversion. Basically, that is concerned with obeying tradition and legitimate authority. And you see that in movements, and you can see it in all kinds of movements, but how but dare you depart from a party line, basically. And fourth, and this you see manifest very vividly in this debate, is the sanctity versus degradation axis, which also goes by the name of the concern with purity. And that often will manifest itself as absolutism, discomfort with trade-offs, exercising in trade-offs, an abstinence model here, given to moral panic, obsessional concern about the children is often symptomatic of that. So these are general dynamics, and they're manifest in so many other debates regarding science and technology. Vaccines, nuclear power, I mean, you can sort of draw the diagrams for each of these. Gun control, genetically modified food, climate science, which is in fact what Kahan focuses on. Now you don't see this with tornadoes, you don't see this with Ebola. The politics there are actually not as complicated. They're more immediate. It's just, they're not a minefield of these competing, what Phil Tetlock would call competing sacred values. And that's how you know you're treading on sacred values, is when there is so much debate and there's so much turmoil. So we're in one on this topic. And in my country, unfortunately, the CDC seems to really fall squarely in what I've called the precautionist camp. With hyper concern about purity and risk aversion and those kinds of dynamics. It gives disproportionate weight to skeptics' unsubstantiated claims, and it minimizes the estimable benefits. It foments panic. I mean, this is really bad for smokers who, and as you know, this is happening, certainly happening a lot in the US. There were people who have already switched or are contemplating switching, have actually gone back to smoking because it's better to, they figure, stick with the combusted devil they know than this frightening new formaldehyde-laden device. This is obviously terrible for the integrity of public health as a field and a shameful violation of public trust in government. So this tension between the pragmatists, which is those interested in value harm minimization, versus the precautionist, sorry to be so dichotomous, but I think this is a legitimate grouping. That's a hard tension to resolve, but I don't think it's impossible. And so how do we accelerate it? Well, here I'm going to talk about the points that sort of summarize, I guess, the points that I've heard by many of the speakers. So I'll start with saying, how do we accelerate it? 1, do everything Clive says. Okay, but and vote for Attic, where is he? You, Attila. Anyway, so framing the issue, so here are my categories. Framing the issue, Drs. Yak and Abrams both talked about this. Shift the emphasis from a smokeless future, which entails eradication of tobacco industry or significant suppression of it, to a vision in which smokers can consume nicotine in the safest way possible. Hammer home, as Dr. Stinson says, the distinction between nicotine, which addicts, and the tar that kills. Of course, this was articulated earlier by Professor Michael Russell. But I was impressed, I guess it was Dr. Yak, I was impressed at how few politicians really grasp that distinction. Another point, regulate in proportion to harm. Underscore the abject insanity of making it harder to use e-cigarettes than it is to use cigarettes. Follow the money and emphasize that. Saving money certainly works in our country. Econometric analyses of how much Medicare and Medicaid and private insurers might save on lung cancer and pulmonary disease if people vaped. All this has come up. I'm not saying anything novel, but I'm just bringing it all together here. Try to make government agencies accountable. I do believe that our CDC is really committing public health malpractice. If you recall, Brown and Williamson, that famous Brown and Williamson memo from 1969 about our product is doubt, well, that should be the motto of the CDC when it comes to e-cigarettes. One thought is oversight hearings in our country, but that might make him look like too much of a victim. There's a lot of theater in these congressional hearings, and there are ways they backfire. But at the very least, congressmen should demand some accountability from him. Write a letter to him asking for concrete answers to very important questions that they've obfuscated or outright misrepresented in their literature. We talked before about making medical journals and prestige media available. When I heard Dr. Farsalina's presentation on all the shoddy papers, I was aware of some of them, but wow, that is enough to drive you to despair. And I know Clive, for example, has worked very hard to get the New England Journal of Medicine to take some sort of responsibility for the formaldehyde study. I think it was a distressing. Forget the true believers, and I believe, forget the true believers and put energy into converting anti-smoking advocates who may have lined up with the true believers, because that's where they started, but who value scientific honesty and pragmatic policy more than they do allegiance to entrenched grudges and group identities. Educate doctors. We have drug reps. Why don't we have vaping reps? I think that would be a great idea. I mean, when I heard, I'm sorry, I can't remember that lady's name there, but Donna. When she spoke at the when she spoke at the media briefing, it's so compelling to hear from a vapor, and also I don't think there's one class of consumer in the world that knows as much about what they're doing than with their product than any other. I'm very impressed with that. Write op-eds in local papers. I gather Lorianne has written an important article, but co-author it with a local pulmonologist or something. Mobilize the shock troops. That's what you also said, Donna. The vapors, patient choice over paternalism. Seize the moral high ground. It's unethical not to allow access to reduced risk. That came up as well. The advocates of bans and heavy regulations say we don't have enough information. Well, they have an obligation to specify what type of evidence would convince them is enough information. And use words like discriminate. I mean, it's discrimination. It can be, well, let me back up a little bit. I mean, when Dr. Bald mentioned Article 5.3, and when the New England Journal, when I think it's JAMA, won't even read your paper for acceptance if it was sponsored by tobacco industry money. This is absurd. It's censorship. And or at the FDA, you can serve on the TPSAC committee, the Tobacco Products Scientific Advisory Council or committee, if you've worked with drug companies, and that's fine with me, but not if you've worked with tobacco companies. That doesn't make sense. I'll close by noting that in the US, the FDA is any minute now, supposedly, within a few weeks, going to comment on deeming regulations. And this is a very sensitive time. I mean, it could obstruct progress with burdensome regulation, or it could do an enormous good by taking a path that basically seeks to reassure smokers that e-cigarettes are indeed safer and much safer, that they are made well, standards, and that they are banned for children. According to David Sweener, he had mentioned to me that in various polls, 60% of smokers had said they would switch. Okay, I realize you can't take everyone at their word, but that's not an immodest number. 60% of smokers would switch to e-cigarettes if they felt they were approved as safer, that they're not going to explode, even though they're not going to explode, but they're not going to explode, e-liquids were high grade, etc. So the FDA has an enormous amount of power here. The person effectively in charge, Mitch Zeller, talks all the time about a continuum of risk and regulating in that manner. But it's uphill, and there's a lot of, because there's just a lot of skepticism in our public health community, and also, I think, a deliberate disinformation campaign. But, so I am optimistic, I think, in the long run, but I'm very guarded in the short run about how quickly sanity will prevail. And I'll tell you my final lesson learned, which is that at this meeting, there clearly exists a vibrant community of researchers, advocates, and consumers devoted to, thoughtful, pragmatic ways to, ignite a revolution that, should be one of the greatest public health revisions in the last 50 years. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.